to Assigned Reading, the podcast where we read feminist essays and talk about them like real humans, not professors. I'm Becky Mollenkamp, and each week, a friend and I will read a powerful piece of feminist writing and talk about it here. There's no grades, there's no pop quizzes, don't worry. The essay is always linked in the show notes if you'd like to read it, but whether you do or not, you're invited to join us and listen in on this conversation. Let's dig in.
So I now claim the word as a word that says, let's center women. And for me, if I'm centering women, just like when I'm centering neurovariants, just like when I'm centering the story of people who are immigrants, when I center marginalized people, everybody is served. And I know that. So for me, feminism is currently a way to center women.
That was one of my favorite humans, Faith Clarke, who also happens to be my business partner in Feminist Founders, which is a newsletter, a membership community, a podcast. I'll put all of that in the show notes so you can go check out what we're doing there. This conversation, as I say in the episode, cracked my brain open in new ways. And I love when that happens. And that's why I'm doing this show. So I'm really, really excited to share it with you. We're discussing We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Adichie. And this is a piece I've read before. It's one that you may know. I encourage you to revisit it. Again, you don't have to listen to the episode, I promise. I'm briefly going to tell you about Faith, and then we're going to get into this one. Faith is an organizational health and inclusion specialist for organizations that are committed to healthy workplace culture. We talk about culture in this episode, so it's perfect. She's redefining work ecosystems for post-pandemic humans looking to do work better. Computer programmer on Wall Street, autism activist, organizational health expert, and now doing inclusion work. Faith's whole career has been influenced by systems and engineering. She helps people by creating systems that integrate human motivation. And every time I talk to her, she helps me see the world in a new way. And I hope she does the same for you in this episode. So let's get started. Hi, Faith. How are you?
Hey, Becky. I'm pretty good.
You're contemplative, you said earlier.
Yes, because I've been listening to Some Reason Labor. That song has been in my head, and perhaps that's aligned with the exhaustion, the overwhelm, the burnout feeling, and just kind of seeing how much that feeling is a part of what society has offered to me versus, we do the Feminist Founders podcast, and I didn't quite go into it, but the idea of there was a trauma to inflammation. There was a chart that I'm going to send it to you so we can put it in the show notes. But there was a chart that I referred to that just talked about the impact of colonization, supremacy, and basically it just led into trauma and inflammation. That even the inflammation in my body right now, 80% of it at least is just tied to systemic stuff, And so that was just it's sobering.
I can feel that in my joints, quite literally. So I know what you're talking about. Well, we're talking today about Chimamanda, and I just looked up how to pronounce her last name. Hold on. Adichie. Chimamanda Adichie. And We Should All Be Feminists. I believe that's what it's called. Now I feel bad right? That's right. Which I had actually, most of these essays we're doing for this, I've never read before. So they're new to me. This, I actually listened to the audiobook version. It was turned into a book, even though it's very short. It's 30 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I've listened to it a few years ago, but I rewatched the TED Talk today. It's also, I think there's a print version available, but I'll link to the TED Talk. And if there's a print version, I'll link to that in show notes. So I just watched it right before we got on. And I'm curious, I'll share my high level thoughts too, but I want to know kind of just that 2,000-foot view of what do you think of this?
Yeah, I really enjoy listening to Chimamanda because she's centering African continent, Nigerian culture, which is very similar to Jamaican culture. So that was often when I'm in conversations about feminism, what's centered in this country is whiteness. And it's not, because it's centered, it's invisible. We talk about feminism as if it's not white feminism. And so it was something beautiful about listening to her narrate the stories that I'm familiar with, even though it's different versions of those stories. It may not be that she talked about the fact that the guy paid the person and the guy thanked the waiter or whoever thanked her male contemporary. And I just, having seen that, different versions of that, just growing up, that kind of difference, assumption and stuff like that. So I quite enjoyed it. I recognized it also as dated meaning, in terms of the article, the essay itself, she did this talk, then she wrote the essay, and then she's been refining, her perspectives all along. And like everything else, as she said in the talk, people shape culture. And so it's our own shaping of our experience that then even creates the change that makes different elements of the conversation relevant to us now in 2025, perhaps than she was referring to in 2017 or 2018 or whatever it was.
2017, yeah.
So I was just also, there's something hopeful about that, some of those shifts, while at the same time, the really long tail, the slowness of change and how much maybe power resists change. So how it snaps back at you and kind of tries to recover itself, thinking about the 1% increase in Black women's unemployment in last month in this country, so just like you think about the there's progress and then there's a snapback, and always, just so recognizing that things have changed, and also recognizing that it's the change is long and hard.
We'll go into all of those things that you talked about more in depth. But first, I want to correct myself. It was 2013. The reason I said 2017 was because I also want to address just sort of upfront that in 2017, Chimamanda had made a statement, trans women are trans women. And that was definitely, especially in the time, very much interpreted as saying trans women are not women, but they are trans women. She later clarified that was not at all what she meant. And that in fact, she was saying trans women have a unique experience as women. And so we need to honor the fullness of their unique experience. And so I read more about, because I had just heard this sort of like rumbling that, not Chimamanda because she's a TERF and let's stay away from that. Having done a little more research for this conversation, I realized that I don't believe that is at all the case. I think that what she was saying was probably not the best way to say what she was saying, and was then also taken and sort of spun out as she was correcting that that's not what she believes. She's fully in support of trans women, do believe trans women are women, just that that's a unique experience different from a cis woman's experience, which is a valid thing to say, I think. Right. So I wanted to point that out really quickly too. So that was in 2017, but I think it's reflective of what you're saying that, this was in 2012, 2017, she sort of put her toe into the trans conversation, went through that experience of, I need to be more careful or more clear about what I'm saying, and that learned more. There is this evolution, because I had the same feeling when I watched it of, this feels dated in a way, and yet still present in a way, right? Some of the references even felt a bit dated, but then also like that reference that you said of giving the money to someone, you giving the money and then looking at someone else. I thought, does that happen? Now, of course, this is my white American experience, right? Which we'll talk about. But I was feeling like, is that dated? And then there's a part of me that thinks, every time my husband and I go to the restaurant, the waiter still puts the check in front of my husband, never in front of me. So it does still, like, there are these things that in some way when I'm listening to it, I'm thinking this does feel of its time a bit, but then also there's a lot of it that still feels fairly relevant now.
Yeah, there's something I appreciated that she centered the conversation in the African continent and in Nigeria. And I think that the conversations that we're having that are not contextualized, what are we even saying? What are we even saying? So I am not a woman. I'm a Black woman. I'm a Black Afro-Caribbean immigrant woman. I am a woman whose mother, right? And I think all of the contextualization is important. And I also think that, the moment I think this kind of speaks to some of what she talked about with misogyny, that women are pushed back on because we're women. And we push back, we hold women to a higher standard of the same perfectionist supremacist ideology that harms us all. So there is an automatic checking. I felt myself do it. Is she correct? In a way that I wasn't aware of doing, if you say it was Trevor Noah, right? And so I'm saying that I am aware. I remember I did a presentation and completely overlooked. I was coming up with some examples of people who modeled the characteristic that I was doing. And I chose a Black man. And in the night, after kind of processing some of how the workshop went, I was just like, oh my goodness, there is this Black woman who outshone this Black man as a model of this thing, but I overlooked her completely. So just in my own work, I have to acknowledge that when I'm asking a question, is she right? Or when I'm kind of saying it's dated or whatever, there is a critique to it. I accept the datedness of men speaking. Whereas I'm there like, is this right? And I think that that's part of what she's talking about, that the oppression of women is so much in the water that we ourselves, do it, just.
For sure. And I mean, for me too, as a white woman and a white American woman specifically, like looking, there's that same thing of me saying, well, this feels a little dated, or is those things relevant, or this isn't my experience. And then that's that checking in of like, well, no, it's not meant to be my
Yeah,
experience.
it's
Right?
not your experience. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's being so accustomed to
Yeah.
things big, especially these conversations around feminism, which is the problem, right? That's a huge problem. But I'm so accustomed to my experience being this experience that is centered that when it's not, it can feel not even challenging, but almost it's easy to dismiss it, right?
Right.
Which
Right.
is exactly the
And I think
problem.
too,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think too, just even, it's impossible. I was in a conversation this weekend past that, this person said it's impossible to separate my womanness from my blackness, and so it's when I think about even whatever, I didn't do the research on what she said about trans women, but I do think that the quickness of our reactions to everybody's stuff is part of the drive towards perfectionism, or to look perfect, to say the right thing. And it's the very thing that stops us from actually being able to bring the equity and equality, that injustice that we need, because everybody has to perform feminism or perform, restorative practice instead of being, and if we can understand within the context of relationship, I hear us saying, somebody asked me this, do we hold people who have large platforms to a higher standard? Yeah, maybe. And also we should hold ourselves to the standard of listening through the lens of the thing we actually want, versus, yeah. Anyway, I could go off on that.
Well, I think it's a great avenue to go down, because I think you're right. Like, and this has come up more than once in this podcast, because, we're reading a selection of essays that go way back in time to much more current. And, the older the essay is, the more through our current lens, we see all of the glaring errors, right? And especially when we're looking at feminism, where very often a lot of the early work, and we're reading things from all types of folks. But some of the things that we're reading from white women are very clearly missing so much of the context you've talked about. They are falling well short of what we would want them to be and what they should have been. And it's like, it's this whole separate the art from the artist thing of like, can we appreciate the pieces that are helpful, that help shape a new narrative, while also critiquing the parts that are not, without it being this like, I hate this expression, but throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like, why do we want to get rid of an entire collection of work because it doesn't fit not even today's, what should have been then, right? But because it wasn't, do we say, well, then none of this matters? And cancel culture is such a hard thing, because, I do agree with people who say it's accountability, right? It's not cancel culture, it's accountability. And someone like Chimamanda has since said, like, that is not what I think. And I think there are still people who harbor that ill will. And it's like, where do we allow that grace? And I love what you said, like, where are we holding ourselves to a different standard?
Yeah. I really think that what we've set up here is quick hits information about a thing and make a judgment, which is so far from what's required to actually build spaces where all genders have equity and justice. And yes, absolutely, there is going to need to be focused work. The more we understand, the more contextual information we build in. Can I celebrate these people who, as blind as they were, did this body of work? Can I not make them bad? Yes, they had racists, all kinds of things that we are now exploring. No, let us hold ourselves accountable to that. But let's not hold them accountable for what we know now. Let's just take what we can and keep it moving. But that's the same thing that stops us from keeping moving, because we're kind of busy with, did they perform it right? According to who? It's according to me, no. So again, I'm not integrating anybody else's context. I'm just kind of centering myself. I'm like,
That's so, yeah, exactly. As you're saying that, I'm thinking that's just yet another way we're centering ourselves in it. And I hope that 12 years from now, that's how old this piece is. I hope 12 years from now, I'm seeing the world differently. Right. I mean, I hope so. I hope that I go back and listen to these podcast episodes 12 years from now and think I could have probably done that better. And oh, my understanding around that issue has definitely changed. And it's not because I want to like shame myself now, but that's an evolution. We should always be looking for that.
I'm celebrating me then for getting me now here. Right.
Right.
So
Me now wouldn't exist without her.
these people who came up with this framework, flawed as
Yeah.
it was, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. So it's
Yeah.
just like, and like I have a person I follow who is like, no, that was faith 2.0. That was faith 3.0. Today is faith 8.0. And it's okay for me to honor 2.0's version of this thing. And this particular person's an artist and they don't even rewrite their songs. They're like, that song was written by my 1.0 version and it is the art of that person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, in this conversation about what did she say? It was one version of feminism is social, political, economic equity for everyone. Who's everyone? That person too, and just like, yeah, good. And also let's pay attention to the things that are in front of us right now.
Yeah. I mean, so this concept of we should all be feminists feels it in a way really sort of simplistic, right? It feels like when I was listening to it, it feels sort of like this very simple concept because some of it, like even the crowd kind of laughs and that makes me a little uncomfortable when they're like, she's sort of saying things about, women are man, these perceptions of feminists as man haters and the people in the audience kind of laugh. And it's several other things where they kind of laugh. And I don't think that she was meaning them as jokes, but you can tell there is this discomfort around some of what she's saying, or it seems so extreme that they're laughing. But I don't know, because that concept feels a little outdated again, but this is 2012, but it all feels a little simple. And yet I think what you're saying, like these things that we're saying about the way she chooses to center a different experience than is normally included in this narrative. The way she talks about gender, even like there are things about it though, although the concept I think feels pretty simple. Like, well, yeah, we should all be feminists. Yeah. Okay. Everyone should be treated fairly and equally and equitably. Okay. But I feel like there's more depth to it when you really start to examine it than I think my first reading gave it credit for. Because my first reading of it, I was just kind of like, duh. You know what I mean? Like, duh, yeah, we should all be feminists. Okay. But this time listening to it, thinking, no, there is so much more to this piece. And I think it is important.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I didn't take the laughter as discomfort. But again, I have an entirely different cultural awareness.
How did you take it?
It was the use of humor in recognizing pain is a thing Black folks do all the time. And so I saw it as, yeah, I'm looking at these faces and it is an ouch, but it's also, we laugh about our pain. And I remembered being in a workshop where it was a primarily Black audience facilitated by white people. And I was helping with the organizing and the facilitator came to me like, why is everybody laughing? I said, yeah, that's one of our processing languages. And so that was kind of how I took that in. And when she said we should all be feminists, I remember the first time I heard her say that, I was also just getting into, what's his name? Anti-racist book.
Ibram.
Yeah, Ibram. Yeah, Kennedy's work. Yeah. And his own expression of you have to be anti-racist. There is no not racist. I think her statement of we should all be feminist,
right,
tied to her own comment about men say, I just don't think that way, is about a man, a person who's not woman, not a man, and especially a white man must own feminism to begin to unearth the ways that they have marginalized women. I say, so you must claim it. You must claim this recognition of it has not been equal and I'm complicit. Just the same as we all have to claim I have racist thoughts. The only way to kind of heal that is to say, I want to be against my racist thoughts. I want to be against my misogyny. And so when I heard her say it, that was how I took it in as Yeah, if it's easy for me as a person who's actively experiencing the oppression, people who have power can't just say, no, I don't do that. And that's kind of.
Yeah, I love that part where she was saying that about it's not because she like I can feel you in the audience, men, sort of saying, I don't think that way. That's not me. This isn't about me because I'm not one of those men, right? In the same way that we recognize all the time with white folks who are like, no, that what you're talking, that's not me. This isn't about me. I don't even have to participate in this because I'm one of the good ones. And you can feel these men sort of, I'm one of the good ones. And she addresses that head on. And I love that because the more that I've been leading into using the word feminist in most of what I do, the more I am being confronted by and really understanding how much men are afraid of that word. They don't believe that they can own it. They don't believe that they are that they're allowed to be. Like, I think even the good ones have all of this misunderstanding around the label feminist because, and the number of women also who think feminist means woman. Right? Like when I in Google thinks feminist means woman. Whenever I search for something feminist, it brings me back all of this women's stuff. And I'm like, women and feminist are two different things. And feminists can be men and should be, right? And yet men feel reluctant to own that and to claim that. And I think part of it feels like it's because they don't think they're allowed to, as in it's our term. And I think there's some worrying about like, am I sort of appropriating that if I do that? Am I stepping where I shouldn't?
I don't think so. I don't think
You
so.
don't think that's why men are like that? Okay, good. Tell me what I'm giving. Am I giving them too much credit?
No, I think it is completely, this thing does not center me. And they're not going to own that. It's too hard. It's too painful. So then it's like, I'm not like this. Why are you trying to put this thing on me? And so there is discomfort in owning that word because of those things. And then the structures of maleness mean that you have to really, the people that the patriarchy have harmed the most are men. Women have been harmed a ton, but the freedom to rethink, reorganize, there's a way that we've had to be active in thinking about it. So many men, because it's a position of privilege and they benefited from it, are blind completely to it and to the harm to them. So yeah, they haven't thought about it at all. And to kind of own the word would be to even think about it. And yeah.
It's interesting and probably very true. I think maybe I'm giving a little too much credit to some men of being generous. She does talk about the ways that patriarchy, misogyny harm men. And I think that was really valuable and interesting because I do think as much as we don't want feminism can't and shouldn't center men. And there is this part of me I rarely can tap into where I think we also have to find ways to help men understand that it is also about them, right? That this is not just about saying women and it's about all people. As she's saying, all people should be feminists because feminism is about equity for all people. And so if that's the case, then that includes men. And one of the ways I think men start to see that is when they can begin to understand how misogyny and sexism and all of that harms them as well. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not the person who's going to educate them.
But even that, right, is we can only get you on board when you see it's harming you.
I know.
Now, you can't attend to the fact that 50% of the population is being harmed and you're benefiting until we say, hey, but you also are harmed. And so I think part of the whole, I told you I'm listening to labor in my head. Part of the whole thing has to be that I let men do men's work. And so I am like, who do I center and be focused on what I'm voicing, and trust that everybody kind of gets a hold of their work, because it's the previous model that says we take away the labor of people higher up by trying to help them understand that we are being harmed,
I mean, I'm not one to do that work. And I know that is not my lane. It's not a lane I'll ever be in. I do not have the patience or spirit for that. There are women who do that work. And in the same way that there are Black folks who are willing to do that labor to help white folks, should they have to? Should they? Like, no. And there are those folks who do that. And I'm grateful for the folks who do. So I'm sure there are men for whom they are grateful that there are women willing to step in that lane and do that work. But I agree with you 100%. We shouldn't have to. It's not our job. We shouldn't have to take on that labor. But it also gets frustrating, I guess, to an extent of like, how long do we wait for men, because men have made it clear they have no, like, they're not interested in taking up that mantle. They're not going to do the work. So I guess maybe the thing is just getting more, and this is probably where it comes down to, is like, we need to get the white women who aren't understanding intersectionality, understanding how all of these issues affect them, and why that they need to start actually making choices based on their interests and not just proximity to power.
Yeah.
I guess that's where the
I think
work
that
is.
for all of us who are in the work, we have to own our place in the work. And yes, men or white women in my case will listen to me. And I find myself uniquely maybe positioned because I also don't have a Black American lens on this in particular. So I'm just different in some. I think we have to own our place and be willing to tell our own vulnerable stories to whoever, right? That's different from I'm here to make you change your mind. There's a way that the centering has been about a single story and been about the application of this single story to everyone. And then, I am an advocate for everyone getting into the nuanced details of their own story and making that visible in whatever ways feel safe to do so, recognizing that people with multiple marginalized identities are more unsafe in telling their stories than others. And I encourage folks, the more privileged identities you have, the safer you can be in telling your story. So get good at listening to what's really going on for you and not telling a story that's kind of like a broad brush stroke of the situation. And I think, so when I listen to Chimamanda, I hear a personally specific story. And I do think that in this country, people listen to it. She's the one who said a story is it's a story. It's an individual story, right? And I think in this country, there is so much need to take everything and make it into a broad brush stroke versus an individual human story, and challenging our own selves to say, what's my relationship to this story? Versus, is this person right or wrong in saying the thing that they're saying? Because that's the same thing. Hierarchy, power over, and, on all the stuff. But
yeah, I'm curious because, so my relation to the story, when she's talking about these ideas around being people starting to use this word feminist about her and her work, and the sort of the confusion or the not understanding, and then learning more about it and sort of owning that and all of it. My relationship to that is, and this is a lot of privilege, and I recognize that, is I never once really, I don't remember a time where I questioned the word feminist for myself or felt uncertain or uncomfortable or any of that. Like, it just felt like, yeah, that's just how I am, right? Like, that is just how I'm wired. And a lot of that has to do with, one, my upbringing with my mom, and the fact that she had left a world that was deeply not feminist, and somehow she got college educated. That's really what it comes down to. She got college educated, and that changed her worldview, and she raised us very differently than she would have been raised. So it's just sort of in the air I breathe. Plus, it is a term that I now, at the time I wouldn't have understood this, but I now understand, is just a label that has been applied more comfortably and liberally to white women historically. And so, of course, it would feel more natural for me. I'm curious your relationship with that part of the story, that discovery of the word feminist, of stepping into and owning it, because I know that there are still many, and again, this will be just your story. I'm not trying to make this universal, but I know there are a lot of Black women for who that word to this day still is really uncomfortable. And I can understand all the reasons for it, but I know you're someone who actually feels, I think, comfortable with that term. And I wonder what your relationship with it is.
yeah, well, I mean, for me with words, I'm pretty comfortable claiming, reframing, defining words for myself. My kind of awakening. So I was feminist before I called myself feminist, but my awakening to stuff in college my awakening was to the harm of enslavement on Black men, because there's something about noticing how the system crushed Black men that was new to me. So the word feminist as a word that emasculated, she used the word emasculate Black men, I was against that very idea. So when I'm introduced to the word as a philosophy that continues to harm Black men, that doesn't help them to kind of heal, and doesn't give proper space to the journey that they'd been on, Caribbean descendants of enslaved men that were bred, that were made into studs. that were separated from their families and used to propagate the peopling of plantations. That had me separate from the idea of hating men, yet no. Right. And again, this is from a position of not having interrogated the word specifically, but I was like, no, I think that recognizing the harm to all the people. So in particular, not saying to men, you are all so horrible, but to recognize what's leading to that, some of that horrible. And when I was referring to Black Caribbean men, that was important to me. No, that I have that feels intact. I understand that. No, I'm recognizing I am, as a woman, also conditioned to save men. And so that doesn't make my recognition bad, but I am conditioned to save men. So even my resistance to ideas around feminism, which I hadn't interrogated, was tied to it doesn't save men, which is about misogyny, is about undervaluing what I might want. Chimamanda said, it's about protecting a woman's right to want. So I now claim the word as a word that says, let's center women. And for me, if I'm centering women, just like when I'm centering neurovariants, just like when I'm centering the story of immigration people who are immigrants, when I center marginalized people, everybody is served. And I know that. So for me, feminism is currently a way to center women, because as a woman, I know that I have the tendency to mistrust women. I have a tendency to mistrust Black women. I have a tendency to critique Black women's voices more, to see it as harsh, to see them as unfriendly. I do that. And it was funny to me, another Black woman said that we Black women refer Black women so much less than we refer other groups of people. And so just to own the misogyny in the water and to heal that, I claim the centering of women, to start fundamentally with the centering of my own self so that I can want what I want and not judge that.
First of all, I want to go back to the part that the beginning of that Pete, of what you were saying there, because there's so much in that was so beautiful, because it speaks to why the Black woman's experience is different than the white woman's experience, and why feminism needs to be able to understand that, evolve to like encompass all of that, right? To say that this under this umbrella is all of us, but it's that misogynoir. And you may know, I'm not sure who coined that phrase. I should know. I'm sorry, I can't think of it. I feel it's like Kimberly somebody, but no, that might be just Kimberly Crenshaw I'm thinking of. Anyway, but misogynoir, which is that very intersection you're talking about, where your own relationship with feminism is not just about your relationship as a woman or your experiences as a woman, as it is for me, which is why it may have felt easier, because it's like, oh, it's about women. Okay, great. I'm a woman. That makes sense. I love it. Where yours has this added layer of your relationship as a Black person and how that term has affected Black folks, and then that overlapping. And that's where that, like, of course there's conflict there, right? Where for me, it becomes so much easier to say, why wouldn't anyone be a feminist, right? Well, there's reasons why. For other people, there's more conflict there, because there are these, like, I think the way you express that about Black men is just so powerful, because that's something obviously that white women, it probably doesn't even, as they're examining their relationship with the word, that's not a part of their experience.
I think that, part of what we just have to own is that in this country anyway, whiteness is made to be this kind of thing that has no definition. So everything has a definition in contrast to whiteness. And because of that, how do you hold on to like what is happening for other people? Because you can't hold on to what it is for yourself yet. And there's a way that I think it's harder for white folks, people who have been called white, who have benefited from being called white, to hold on to what their specific story is. Because it is like a bland wall with, and I am the painting on the wall. And do you like this painting? Do you not like the painting? Is a whole conversation about me. And so I think that it has to, I don't know that feminism needs to take on the nuance of everything. I think all of us who are framing what feminism is like now need to do the work. And I think it's harder work for white folks to frame ourselves in this story. And so it's easier for me when I'm doing anti-racist work to talk to white women about framing their story because they're used to woman. They know, right? And so I can kind of lean into that and then expand it over into what happens for Black folks or BIPOC folks around, oppression and stuff like that. But I do think that there's a unique challenge and opportunity to be like, what if there is any such thing as a background wall? What's me as a picture on that wall? And what's my story of power and oppression? Because we all have one, all of us. And when we can own our story of power and oppression, it'll be so much easier for us to do some of this work of like, oh, how do our theories include all our stories,
Yeah.
But I think there's a way. Yeah.
Well, I was just say, as a white person, I will say, like, that is very challenging for a lot of white folks, right? And I think we often hold on to the oppressed identity we hold because it's in some ways easier than having to confront the power position that you hold, right? And having to look at that white wall instead of saying, oh, but I'm also a woman and look at that pretty art. And but I'm queer, look at this art, right? Like if someone was to ask me the things like the identities I hold, white would not be the first one I go to. In fact, it would probably be one of the last, right? I think of myself as a woman. I think of myself as queer. I think of myself as a mother. Like these are all identities that I hold that have some oppression to them. And I think there's something about that experience that does feel it's the othering. And that is because, and what you're saying is like, we can't have othering if there isn't what's the not other. And that is the whiteness. And that is really hard to confront because it's not something I can change. Like, this is how I was born. I can't change how I was born. And having to confront that, like, I hold this identity that causes other people to feel othered, causes myself even to feel othered. And I can't change it. I have to confront it. Like, that is really, it feels icky, right? It feels icky. And yet we have to do it. But I just think that way of like, I love that framing of the blank space, the white wall.
Here's the thing though.
Yeah.
You have been oppressed by your whiteness.
Okay.
And there is a way that I have been oppressed by my neurotypical passingness, right? I have been oppressed by that because we live in a world where we've done this hierarchy and it doesn't matter where we land in a prison that it's not us. It's a prison, right? And so how has whiteness been a prison for you? And it's not, I mean, how is neurotypicalness a prison for me? How is being smart? How is going to an Ivy League school a prison? That's the work of framing ourselves as a painting on the backdrop versus just being the backdrop that then is in contrast to everything else. That's part of what creates the saviorism, I think, in any identity where we're trying to do, I'll help you, because we are not, kind of just owning our own complex story of oppression and advantage. And I think all of us have that story and some of us have more of the oppression than others. And, but I do think that it's that then will tell feminism as a different story, as a story of like, oh, there is this complex interweaving of oppression and advantage for all of us. And how do we kind of be with that when we're in a moment with another human being with a different balance of oppression and advantage? And then how do we hold that like as a sacred thing versus trying to have rules about how this is how justice work is done. We will forever fail. This is
that piece right there makes me feel like I can start to see, and thank you for this, because it's not an exploration I think I've done enough of, which is how have I been oppressed by my white identity? And I can see that prison in a way in what you're just saying of like, this is how it's done, the rigidity of whiteness, the rules of whiteness, and the ways that those have made me show up in ways that aren't fully me, that have made me sort of suppress real parts of me because they don't fit the rules of whiteness and the way I'm, just as you're talking about earlier, within Black culture, it's common to laugh at the pain or something, right? And maybe that feels good. And I've missed out on that because the rules of whiteness don't, haven't given me that space to do that. Like, it's just a small example, but it's just that thinking of like, what are prison, the box inside of that I've been forced to stay inside of because of whiteness. And I think when you start doing so much of this, like unlearning and all of this work as a white person, the invitation feels like to not deny your whiteness, but to, in a way, like try to, the saviorism piece, probably trying to make amends for it, right? Like, how do I make amends for this thing that I didn't want, that I have, and like, that is causing harm to others, without it being that piece of, how's it causing harm to me? And how do I fix that within me? Because if I can fix that within me, then that changes my relationship, just in this very example of like this piece. If I were having that freedom to laugh at trauma, to laugh at pain, as just a very small example, when I watched that, I would have had a different relationship with that, right? Like that would have opened something up for me. So it's just such a beautiful invitation.
Yeah, I think that even like as an example, how have my own prisons informed what I believe about other people?
Right.
Just in a micro moment. I know I'm not supposed to judge people in the big things, but just in a micro moment, how's my prison informed that? Yeah, there's so many of these pieces I've heard Black folks talk about the relationship to some of the history that some people want to repress. And it's like, why don't our white friends align with the people who helped with the Underground Railroad? And there's so many people who have been powerful advocates of all kinds of stuff. What's the thing that says, my goodness, I am so ashamed of being white? Yes, yes, you benefit. I'm not denying that, but there's just something that goes straight to shame. That's a prison. And if we can kind of interrogate that a bit and understand, break it apart, and then it just gives us some more space in all this work. What are our prisons? And how does that help us have compassion? Because then what power does, not, whiteness in this case, but what power does is, instead of looking at how we've had a prison, you're just like, I don't want to look at the prison, so I'm going to put you in prison to make sure you don't let me look at my prison, because that's what power does.
That's what's happening right now, right? In this culture with the reaction to DEI, right? Is exactly that. And it's like, but what you're saying has me thinking, I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm saying in any way that Trump is right, because I'm not. But it has me thinking, the way that we have taught about racism, slavery, these kinds of issues within America has perhaps not been the best approach to it. The answer isn't to do what we're doing now, which is instead, let's hide it all. Let's just go back. Like, let's step 20 steps backwards. But the piece that I feel is missing, that you're speaking to, is, as a white person learning that, it does feel like it was shameful. And it is shameful. It's a shameful past, but it's not my shame today unless I make it my shame today. And how could we instead teach, what do we do? How do you examine the ways that it's harmed you as a white person? Like, that was certainly never discussed, right? Because I think it is grounded on the shame. So we can't, if as a white person, I'm to say, how has slavery, the history of slavery in this country, how has it like caused a prison for me? That feels so wrong. And yet, I think I hear that, like, there is something there to explore that would change everyone's relationship to these things. The answer is not put it in that box, throw it away, and hope we just don't ever have to talk about it again. But I would if I had a teacher talk about slavery in the ways that you're talking about that, I can't imagine how that would have shaped my life moving forward, how that would have changed me.
But you wouldn't have had that reinforced in the society around you, right?
Well, yes, I'm saying if we, right.
Yeah,
but if we're all teaching it, if it's like, it becomes.
And so what has happened is that as people have liberated themselves and told their stories, then it shows up that other people haven't told their story properly. And so there is an opportunity to tell a different story for white folks, and not to tell it in a way that is repressive of the facts of the story, but also to own the fullness of the story. And that's what Black folks have done, to own the fullness of the story. And it's a horrible story, because the story that was being told before, is a story that says, hey, we saved Black folks from, their stuff and brought them here to civilization. And I think that there's something about this story of shame is a story that was invented by whiteness. and by power, and needs to be deconstructed by whiteness and by
Absolutely.
power, in a way that embraces what's really going on, versus to say you have nothing to be ashamed of, because this is the other extreme. It wasn't you, it was your ancestors or whatever it is. So you're not white, you're not racist, you're not, misogynist, you're not whoever. And it's like, it's also a way to not own the whole story. And I think all of us, back to this, let's own our own stories and tell our stories and listen to each other's stories and own that they're different stories, and that we're all being harmed by the same thing, the hierarchy that we've created with story and with
Yeah.
value.
Well, I've always said that shame is the sharpest tool in the oppressor's toolkit. And I do believe that. I mean, even if we take it outside of issues around race and stuff, if we look just at like abusive relationships, interpersonal relationships, time and again, you see an abuser using shame as a way to keep their victim from leaving, right? Because if you can make someone feel so bad about themselves, they will not take action. And that is exactly what it feels like, where whiteness uses shame as a way to protect whiteness, right? Because
It's fair though. It's really fair. Shame is covering fear. And I think the oppressor's tool is the biggest tool, is the fear. And for white folks and for people higher up in power, the shame acts as a way to keep you from acknowledging, I don't want to lose my place. This is scary. I see what happens to Black folks. I don't want that to happen to me and my kids.
yeah.
And so it's fear. And can we kind of, like, fear is our common, like, we all have this fear in common. But some of us, get to feel it out front. And
Well, because some people don't have as much privilege to not have to be with the fear, right? To find ways to avoid the fear. And that's, yeah. I wanted to make sure, because I know our time's coming up here, but you mentioned at the start, and the quote that I pulled out from this essay on my little quote board is, people do not make, or culture does not make people, people make culture.
I
And
wrote it down.
and I did too, because I really loved it. And you mentioned it as well. And it feels like, as we were just saying, you were like, well, one teacher teaching you something isn't going to change anything because you're going out in these waters. But the point of but if we all start to make these changes, and we are, you're right, at this individual level, but I'm just envisioning a world where it could happen inside the schools as well. But that's how we change these things, right? But I'm just curious what you felt like, because you wrote it down as well. It must have meant something to you. What did that bring up for you?
Yeah, well, that my work with culture in organizations, I'm always, I think maybe it's the systems person in me, I'm always asking the question in a system, where do we intervene? Like, people come to you with complex stuff and you're just like, I believe we intervene in groups of 4 and 5 and 8 people. So if I were working in health and whatever, I'd be intervening on whatever people call family. And in organizations, I intervene on wherever we call team. I think culture shaping needs to happen in tiny pockets. We do not shape culture in 2,000 to 10,000 people. And so when she said that it's people shape culture, I was like, there are people who must own their power to influence, who must own their ability. Yeah, we can protest and we can work on policy. That's just not my work. My work is in this group of 5 people, between me and Becky, what's our culture of being with difference? What's our culture? What's our practice? What's our ritual? What's our equivalent of dancing? What's our paraphernalia around celebrating the individual story? What's our way to kind of say, hey, this is you kind of hiding behind this power identity. How do I lean into that? So when she said people shape culture, I see the people as a catalyst. And I'm like, where are you catalyzing a pocket of change? And every teacher in every classroom, every, person in a family, we're either reinforcing culture. She said, and I wrote this down, culture, she said, unlearn the prison of gender. I'm like, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But she said that culture is for preservation and continuity. And so in my mind, I must, as a person, I'm either preserving and continuing, or I'm disrupting in my little pocket of 4 and 5 people. How am I doing that?
Yeah, because when I read or heard that, culture doesn't make people, people make culture, it made me think just this feeling that we sometimes excuse ourselves from being part of the change because it feels too big. culture. It's the culture. I can't change the culture. I can't change the systems. It's just those are the way they are. That sort of feeling of like, how do I as one person affect any change? And my thought was exactly, and what, going with what you're saying too, of like, yeah, but groups of people are what form and begin to change culture.
Yeah.
Culture doesn't, we don't have to just accept culture as this monolith thing that exists and there's nothing that can ever change it. It is changed and is shaped by us. And that, to me, it felt like this permission slip of sorts to say, yeah, you do. This is you, that you get to make this decision by owning this word feminist, by understanding these values, by expanding your understanding of what that means, all of that. You get to be a part of shaping a new culture.
Yep.
Yeah, that
Absolutely.
feels empowering.
Not to undervalue your own, like, what did they say, that we're 6 degrees of separation from anyone? So it's not like I am in proximity to 6 people who are in proximity to, and so what's my intention, back to, stuff that we've talked about, what's my intention of practice around this shaping in the spaces that I'm in, how do I kind of keep myself awake to how I want to be in the world, even in protest to, what's being reinforced around me.
Yeah, and and stop underselling, undervaluing that the work that we as individuals, who then are in contact with other individuals who become a web of people who become the culture, like to not undersell and undervalue the importance of the work
Right.
you do, and that work does have meaning, and that we can't excuse ourselves from the fight just because it feels too big, because it like you said, it's one person at a time. And Faith, you've affected me. So there's at least one of your 6, right, that you've affected. And hopefully people listening, because I can't imagine any white person anyway listening to this today who's not going to be thinking a little bit differently about their relationship with whiteness, their relationship with oppression. And that is part of that, right? The more that we do this, then we're starting to create these webs that become culture. That is culture. Like you said, even that group of 6, it's a culture. It's not
Yeah.
maybe the greater culture, but it's a
Not the
culture. And those begin
macro,
to,
but yeah, absolutely.
yeah, which then begin to affect the culture. I wanted to mention one other thing before we go, which is because you just said, like, that's not my lane, or like, activism or whatever the thing is, the ways that we show up and helping in one way, like, do we help men or not? This book, and you've probably read it, but it's called Social Change Now from Deepa Iyer. And it is this social change roadmap. And inside of it, I wonder if I can find it for people who are looking on YouTube, but I highly recommend people look at it because it talks about these different ways that here it is. There's this wonderful little guide here that shows, like, in the center basically is activism, it's change, it's equity, liberations, justice, solidarity in the middle. But there's all of these little paths that help to get there. And all of those together are what create change. Some of that looks like being the storyteller. You mentioned storyteller. Chimamanda, like, that is storytelling, and it is a part of getting us there. It's not just the people who are out on the front lines. It's not just the people who are specifically and explicitly educating people. It's the people who are healing those people. It's the people who are telling their stories and contributing to the conversation. There are so many ways that we can be a part of creating the change. And I think too often we think it has to look a certain way. So I like that you mentioned, like, you're identifying where's your piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. And I think to also just drop an intersectional lens on that your piece of the puzzle can depend on which fight you're in. Yes, the overall fight is equity, justice, and liberation for all. And in the space of neurodiversity, I may be in an educator type role, whereas in the space, there are, again, back to perfectionism. We have a way to be judging people's engagement in the fight. This is what you should be doing. You should, march or not march. And I'm just like, listen, I have the immigrant thing. I have the queer thing, the trans thing. I have the woman thing. I have, right? Like, what am I doing in what lane? And again, as a black bodied woman who sits really on the bottom of the totem pole of how, so rest is like, and am I working on my resting? Oh, resting is the revolution. Like, we all want to really pay attention to where we sit in that circle. And if your thing is not listed in that circle, claim a thing and call it, this is the way I engage in this thing. My birthday was last week, as you know. Somebody sent me a poem, and they're saying Black folks don't celebrate a birthday, they celebrate a birth week, a birth month. For so many of us, we're here longer than they thought we would be. And so my existence is the celebration. and my existence is the protest, is the pushback. And can I own that as enough? Because for so many of us, women in particular, our sense of enoughness is not.
There's never enough, right?
It's not. I have to be right. So again, where did it come from that I have to be protesting and working on equity in a particular way? Who said?
No. And what Deepa also talks about is the ways that can change your relationship. Just as you said, in one space, it might look like one part, another, it's another. In some places, it's more than one. So it's not, there's nothing prescriptive about that model either. It's very much like you're saying, like figure out, it's more about it being expansive and allowing yourself that invitation to say, activism looks different for different people. And we have to be okay with that because like you said, too often there's this judgment that comes up, especially like the far left is just as guilty as the far right of these sort of black and white thinking, all or nothing, my way or it's wrong. And we have to say, like you said, like, for many people, existence is resistance. For many people, rest is resistance. Like that is how they're participating in the resistance in a world that says they're not allowed those things, right? So yeah, I think I just love that you brought it up in a way too. And I just wanted to point that out because I think it's an important piece of all of this puzzle.
I love that graphic. I've shared it with people. Yeah.
It's so good. Thank you, Faith. I think this conversation, I don't like playing favorites, but it is among my very favorite because it's really cracked my brain open to think about things in a new way. And I'm going to sit with that for a while. And I know with certainty it will affect the way I parent. And that's huge, because I am parenting a white man, a future white man. And I think a lot about that. And I want to really re-examine some of the ways I talk about issues with him to make sure that I am not creating a future savior, that instead I'm creating somebody who can examine things and understand the ways that his oppression has also been his own oppression. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of this. It was wonderful.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you for being part of this assigned reading conversation. If you liked it, please pass it on. And if you loved it, would you leave a review? It will only take you a few seconds, but honestly, it makes a huge difference in spreading the word about the show. The essay is linked in the show notes, as is my newsletter, which is called Feminist Rants Are My Superpower, and I hope that you'll subscribe. I can't wait for our next conversation.